Today, we're reviewing Dave Ramsey's baby steps to see if the advice is actually sound, and we're going to give each one a grade and an overall grade to see if it's advice that you should follow. If you somehow don't know who Dave Ramsey is, he's almost a billionaire who's built a business off of providing people financial education and giving them tools and resources to get out of debt. Nearly 10 million people have gone through his courses, read his books, and followed his financial baby steps, so let's see if they followed good advice. Baby step number 1, save $1,000 for your starter emergency fund. This is a super controversial one because a lot of people argue that $1,000 is not enough for an emergency fund, which is true. Although, to give Dave credit, they do acknowledge that this is a starter emergency fund and not the end emergency fund. In fact, nearly 60% of Americans don't have $1,000 in savings, so if you do this, you're already better off financially than most Americans. Additionally, most expenses are under $1,000, so if you have a flat tire or have to go to a doctor's visit, you're generally able to cover that with less than $1,000. This is also a good attainable number because $1,000 is something that most people can generally come up with if they cut back on going out to eat, canceling unwanted subscriptions, and selling their unnecessary stuff online or at a garage sale, and they generally can do this within 1 to 2 months to get $1,000. There is one massive issue I have with this one though, which is that Dave Ramsey recommends that you don't take advantage of your employer match while you're trying to get this $1,000. To me, it really hurts because you essentially get a 50 to 100% rate of return immediately by having your employer match in your 401k, and leaving that on the table just feels so wrong to leave a basically guaranteed rate of return that's immediate. So for me, I really struggle with that piece, but I do think this is a really good piece of advice just in general to try to get to $1,000. So I still like this baby step and I give it a green light. Baby step number 2. Pay off all debt except the house using the debt snowball. Here is another massively controversial baby step. This one's controversial for 2 reasons. First, the finance community debates this because the snowball method versus the avalanche method. The snowball method, as mentioned, has you pay the debts from the lowest balance to the highest balance, regardless of interest rate. This means objectively, you are just going to be worse off than if you pay off the highest interest rate first. However, Dave Ramsey recommends using this method because it causes people to feel that progress and makes them more likely to be able to actually pay off all of their debts. The avalanche method has you pay off the highest interest rate first, regardless of balance. Where I struggle with this one is it depends on the individual. If you are somebody who feels that you can be really patient and have a lot of self-discipline with your budget and just making sure that you can pay off that highest interest rate as fast as possible, you will objectively be better off. This does require a lot of discipline and patience, so if you feel like you might struggle with that, then that's where the snowball method makes a lot more sense. There is a second issue with this method. If you're investing in the S&P 500, it tends to yield somewhere between 8 to 12% per year on average. There are years where it's up and years where it's down. However, if you average that out to the normal return of somewhere around 10% and you have very low interest debt, let's say 4%, you can take advantage of that gap and get that extra 6% by investing in the stock market over the long run rather than paying off that debt. In fact, if you're just 20 years old, you end up actually getting a return of $88 for every dollar that you invest in the stock market. However, if you have high interest debt, then it makes more sense to pay those off early. For example, credit cards tend to have interest rates between 20 to 30%, meaning you're objectively just better off paying your credit card, but not necessarily every debt. If you want to learn more about compound interest, make sure to subscribe and follow for more content like that because I'm going to be putting out a lot of videos just about financial topics, just like compound interest. There's another source of debate with this though, depending on your age. So if you're age 45 or older, generally you're more likely to be better off by paying off your debt because you're likely to get less of a return in the stock market because your investments tend to get more conservative as you get closer to retirement. And you also want to minimize your debt payments just so that you lower your risk as you get closer to that retirement age. But the younger you are, the more it tends to make sense to invest in the stock market rather than pay down low interest debt. There's also been studies that I find really fascinating that show that there's a link between debt and unhappiness. And there's a statistically significant change that if you pay off your debt, you can actually end up being happier. So essentially, this depends on the person, but if debt keeps you up at all, I fully support you paying off your debt. It's still really helpful to do that. We're talking about the difference between great and optimal. But if you've paid off your debt, I want you to be happy, and I'm proud of you. Overall, I think Dave's advice is really good here. It doesn't really take into account everybody's individual circumstances or what their interest rate is on their debt. So for me, I don't think I can fully greenlight this one. I'll give this one a yellow light. Baby step number 3, save 3 to 6 months of expenses in a fully funded emergency fund. This is essentially finishing that first baby step of getting $1,000, because we're fully finishing that emergency fund now, and the biggest source of debate is whether you should have 3 months or 6 months of expenses. If you lose your job and you feel you'd be able to find a job quickly, then it makes a lot of sense to go with a 3-month emergency fund. If you have dependents, whether that's a spouse or kids, then it might make more sense to have a 6-month emergency fund so that you have that extra buffer just in case it takes longer to find a job to replace your current job. I love this baby step. It's widely accepted in the community, so let's give this a green light. Baby step number 4, invest 15% of your household income in retirement. Here we are at another controversial baby step. This one's controversial because the debate is whether or not 15% is really enough, and it really depends on just your own personal life situation, what age you are, if you have any investments already. There's so much to consider here, and a blanket 15% is widely debated. So let's take this at 2 extremes. Let's say you just started working and you're 22 years old. A 15% investment rate is probably going to be enough to fully fund your retirement. However, if you've waited until you're age 40, 15% is probably not going to be enough, and you're going to need to bump that up to say 20 or 25% just to make sure that you can fully fund your retirement. On a positive note, this 15% savings rate is still higher than what most Americans do, so you're still going to be better off, but it still is something that we need to just look at the individual circumstance before saying that 15% is just enough. This one's really dependent on your own personal life situation, so I don't think I can fully give this one a green light. It just depends on where you are and how much you need to save. So I give this one a yellow light. Baby step number 5, save for your children's college fund. I love this one. Having this already set in place gives your child the option to go to college. And that's really what the purpose is of a lot of money, is just to give you options in life. And if you can set up your children's life to have the option to go to college, that can be a really transformative piece of their life and is a great first step. Additionally, the earlier you start investing for their 529, the easier it is because of the rule of 72. In finance, we have this rule of 72, which states that if you take 72 divided by the interest rate, you get the rough amount of time it takes to double your investment. So if you invest in the S&P 500 and earn roughly 10% per year, on average it takes 7.2 years for that money to double. If you start investing in this while your child's just a few years old, then you can essentially quadruple every dollar you put into it, drastically cutting down on the amount that you need to save later to pay for that college. This isn't guaranteed, and it might not be as great of a decision to be fully invested in S&P 500 just before they're in college, but this is still a really good place to just start investing and getting them that option to be able to go to college. Baby step number 6, pay off your home early. Shocker, this one's another controversial one. This one's really good because you can end up paying off your highest expense and lowering that risk. However, if you have a really low interest rate mortgage, you can take advantage of that by investing in the stock market and getting, say, a 10% return instead of paying off your 2 to 4% low mortgage rate if you were able to lock in a really low rate like that. If you're also really young, it makes a lot more sense to invest in the stock market because you are more likely to get a more positive return over a long run than you would if you were to pay off your debt. For example, if you're 20 years out from retirement, it's never happened in the history of the stock market where the S&P 500 has been negative over a 20-year time span. Now, you can't fully predict future performance based off of past performance, but it is highly unlikely that if you pay off really low interest debt, that investing in the S&P 500 would be a lower return than that. Again, if you're stressed out by having a mortgage payment or having debt at all, it's still a really good idea to pay it off early, and you will be drastically better than most Americans. So this is still a really great decision. Again, we're just talking about the difference between optimal and great. This one is still really good, but it doesn't take into a lot of consideration about where you are in life. So I'm giving this one a yellow light. Baby step number 7, build wealth and give. I love this one. This is something we should always try to do, even if we're before baby step number 7. As Rachel Cruz says, give a little until you can give a lot. I have absolutely no issues with this one, so I give it a green light. So how did Dave do? Well, we rated 4 of them green and 3 of them yellow, meaning that overall his advice passed. It makes a lot of sense. You almost can't go wrong following this advice, and if you do it, you'll be better off than if you don't. It's not optimal, so if you want optimal, take into consideration those things that I mentioned, speak with a financial coach or a financial advisor, but thanks for watching.